There are places on this earth where time has been buried so completely, so thoroughly sealed beneath stone and sand, that the world they once held seems almost impossible to imagine. Places where the ground beneath your feet is not just rock, it is memory. Compressed, fossilized, ancient memory stretching back so far that the very concept of human history becomes laughably small by comparison. 100 million years, say that number slowly, let it settle. 100 million years ago, while the continents were still finding their shapes, while the oceans were drawing new coastlines across a world we would not recognize, there existed in what is now the scorched and windswept badlands of North Africa a place of almost incomprehensible abundance. A river system so vast, so teeming with life, so dominated by creatures of terrifying scale and power, that modern science is only now beginning to piece together just how extraordinary it truly was. This is the story of the Kem Kem, an ancient river system that once carved its way through the heart of a Cretaceous world, fed by monsoon rains, sheltered beneath a sky that had never seen a human eye, and populated by an assemblage of predators so dense, so diverse, and so enormous that by every rule of modern ecology, the system should not have worked. And yet it did. For millions of years, it thrived. Giants moved through its waters and stalked its banks. The air above its surface trembled with the wingbeats of creatures that dwarfed any living bird. The river itself pulsed with fish the size of automobiles, armored and ancient, cruising through warm brown water beneath a canopy of prehistoric vegetation. And then slowly, inevitably, it ended. The seas rose, the land changed, the river was swallowed by a shallow inland ocean, and the animals that had evolved so precisely for this one remarkable place disappeared with it, leaving behind only fragments. Teeth. Bones, scales pressed into stone. Scattered clues for scientists to find millions of years later, scattered across a landscape that bears almost no resemblance to the paradise it once was. When giants ruled the river, the lost world of the Kem Kem is the story of that vanished world. It is a story of science and discovery, of fossils lost and found and lost again, of researchers who dedicated their lives to understanding creatures that no human being has ever seen alive. It is a story of an ecosystem so alien and yet so logical that studying it forces us to rethink everything we believe about how nature balances itself, how predators coexist, how life finds a way to fill every possible space available to it. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now let us go back, 100 million years back, to the river, to the giants. To the lost world of the Kem Kem. To understand the Kem Kem, you first have to understand that the world of 100 million years ago was not simply the modern world with different animals walking across it. It was a fundamentally different planet. The continents, those massive slow-moving rafts of rock that we take for granted as permanent features of the Earth's surface, were arranged in configurations so different from today that a map of the Cretaceous world would look like something from a fantasy novel rather than a geography textbook. Africa existed, broadly speaking, in something approaching its current position, but it was connected to and separated from other landmasses in ways that dramatically shaped which creatures lived where, how they evolved, and what ecosystems were possible. The Cretaceous period itself, spanning roughly from 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago, was one of the most biologically productive and climatically unusual periods in the history of life on Earth. The planet was significantly warmer than it is today. There were no polar ice caps of any consequence. Sea levels were dramatically higher than they are now, so high in fact that vast shallow seas covered portions of what we now think of as continental interiors. The atmosphere held more carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect was more pronounced. And as a result, life, particularly plant life, was extraordinarily lush, extensive, and diverse in ways that supported animal communities of staggering complexity and scale. Flowering plants, the angiosperms that now dominate nearly every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, were only just beginning to diversify during this period. The landscapes of the Cretaceous were still heavily defined by older plant groups, ferns, cycads, conifers, and horsetails, creating a visual texture quite unlike anything you would encounter in a modern forest. Imagine walking through a world where the undergrowth is thick with ferns that grow chest-high, where towering conifers form the canopy above you, where the edges of rivers are lined not with the willows and cottonwoods we might expect, but with strange, ancient plant forms that have no direct equivalent in today's world. It was green, certainly, rich with life, unquestionably, but different in texture, in smell, in sound, in every sensory quality that we use to understand the natural world around us. In this world, in the region that would eventually become the border zone between what is now Morocco and Algeria, the climate and geography conspired to create something remarkable. A great river system, not a single channel but an entire network of waterways, wetlands, floodplains, and seasonal pools, stretched across a landscape that received abundant seasonal rainfall. This was not a dry, desert-like environment. This was a wet, dynamic, seasonally flooded river basin that in its character and ecology bore some resemblance to the great tropical river systems that still exist today, systems like the Congo, the Amazon, or the Nile during its ancient flood cycles. But superimposed onto this general framework was the particular biology of the Cretaceous, with its impossibly large fish, its flying reptiles, its semi-aquatic dinosaurs, and its land-based predators of terrifying scale. The name Kem Kem comes from the geological formation, the Kem Kem beds, a series of sedimentary rock layers exposed today along what is called the Kem Kem escarpment, a dramatic geological feature that runs along the border region of Morocco and Algeria. These rock layers, composed of sandstones, mudstones, and siltstones deposited by ancient rivers and floodplains, preserve within them the fossilized remains of the creatures that lived in and around this ancient river system. They are, in the most literal sense, pages from a book about a lost world, and paleontologists have been reading those pages, laboriously and often fragmentarily, for more than a century. The rocks themselves tell a story of deposition, of sediment laid down by moving water, layer upon layer, year after year, millennium after millennium, until the slow pressure of geological time compressed them into stone. Within those layers, sometimes in the most unexpected and fragmentary ways, the remains of Cretaceous life were preserved. A tooth here, a fragment of jaw there, a vertebra, a femur, a scale from an enormous fish, pressed into stone and waiting for the day when erosion would expose it again at the surface, and a sharp-eyed fossil hunter would notice something that didn't quite look like ordinary rock. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how improbable fossilization is. The vast majority of living things that have ever existed on this planet left absolutely no fossil record whatsoever. Soft-bodied creatures rarely preserve. Animals that live in upland environments where erosion dominates over deposition rarely preserve. Even large-bodied animals with hard bones can vanish without a trace if the conditions are not exactly right, if the body is scavenged before burial, if the burial is too shallow, if groundwater chemistry dissolves the bone before mineralization can occur. The existence of any fossil is, in some fundamental sense, a miracle of circumstance. The existence of the Kem Kem fossil assemblage, with its remarkable diversity of large predators and prey animals, represents millions of years of favorable preservation conditions, and we should be grateful for every fragment that survived. But before we dive into the fossils themselves and the creatures they represent, we need to understand the engine that drove the Kem Kem ecosystem. We need to understand the river itself and the climatic force that gave it life, the monsoon. Monsoon. The word conjures images of gray skies and torrential rain, of streets flooding and rivers swelling, of a seasonal transformation so dramatic that it defines the entire rhythm of life in the regions it touches. In the modern world, monsoon systems affect enormous portions of South Asia, West Africa, and parts of the Americas, bringing seasonal rainfall that fills rivers, floods fields, triggers migration, drives agricultural cycles, and supports biodiversity on a scale that would be impossible in the absence of this reliable annual pulse of water. In the Cretaceous world of the Kem Kem, something broadly analogous to a monsoon system drove the hydrology of the region. The warm Cretaceous climate, combined with the particular arrangement of land masses and ocean basins, created conditions in which large portions of what is now North Africa received dramatic seasonal rainfall. During the wet season, which would have been analogous in general terms to the rainy seasons of modern tropical Africa, vast quantities of water fell across the landscape, feeding rivers that swelled to enormous proportions, flooding lowland areas, connecting what had been isolated pools and channels into a single vast interconnected aquatic network, and triggering explosions of biological productivity throughout the system. Think about what this means in practical ecological terms. When water is abundant, when channels are full and floodplains are inundated, aquatic life has access to an enormous amount of habitat. Fish can move freely through connected waterways, aquatic invertebrates can colonize new areas, vegetation at the water's edge is stimulated by the moisture. The entire aquatic ecosystem expands in space, and as it expands, the populations of animals it supports grow. Fish populations in particular respond dramatically to the availability of flooded habitat. Many fish species use floodplain environments for breeding, taking advantage of the shallow, warm, vegetation-rich waters to lay eggs and rear juveniles in conditions that offer more food, and temporarily at least, fewer predators than the main river channel. During the wet season of the Kem Kem, the ancient river would have expanded dramatically. What had been a defined channel surrounded by drier terrain would have transformed into something much more diffuse, a broad zone of shallow water, reed beds, flooded forest margins, and interconnected pools stretching across a lowland landscape. Cretaceous fish, and there were fish of extraordinary size and diversity in this system, as we will discuss in detail shortly, would have exploited this expanded habitat with the efficiency that evolution had given them over hundreds of millions of years. Breeding, feeding, growing, dispersing through the connected network of water, and then the rains would stop. The dry season in a monsoon-driven system is not merely a period of reduced rainfall. It is a period of active contraction, of water evaporating and draining away, of channels narrowing, of pools shrinking, of the vast connected aquatic network fragmenting into a series of increasingly isolated and increasingly crowded refugia. Imagine the process in reverse, the floodplain drying, the shallow sheets of water retreating, the fish that had dispersed so freely through the wet season suddenly finding themselves in smaller and smaller bodies of water, concentrating as the water concentrates, packed together in pools and channels that cannot expand to accommodate them. This concentration effect is one of the most important ecological dynamics in any monsoon-driven river system, and in the ancient Kem Kem, it would have been profound. As the dry season advanced, the fish, the turtles, the crocodilians, and all the other aquatic and semi-aquatic animals of the system would have been pushed into progressively smaller areas of remaining water. Density would have increased dramatically. Competition for food within these refugia would have intensified, and critically, from the perspective of the large predators that depended on this prey, the prey would have become extraordinarily concentrated and accessible. For a creature like Spinosaurus, an enormous semi-aquatic predator that we will meet in great detail as this story unfolds, the dry season would have represented something almost like a feast delivered by the landscape itself. Instead of having to range widely through dispersed habitat searching for prey, the predator could simply station itself at a remaining pool or along a narrowing channel and wait. The prey would come to it, or more accurately, the prey would already be there, concentrated by the retreating water, unable to escape because the land between pools offered no route to safety for a fish or a turtle or any other primarily aquatic animal. This seasonal pulse, abundance followed by concentration, expansion followed by contraction, dispersal followed by crowding, was the fundamental rhythm that the entire Kem Kem ecosystem danced to. Every creature in this ancient world, from the smallest fish to the largest dinosaur, had its life shaped by this cycle. The timing of breeding seasons, the patterns of migration, the behaviors of predators, the defensive strategies of prey, all of these were calibrated to the annual rhythm of the monsoon in ways that we can, at least partially, reconstruct from what the fossils tell us about the animals involved. The river itself, in its physical character, would have been something magnificent. Ancient river systems are not simply scaled-up versions of modern rivers. They have their own character, their own patterns of flow, their own particular relationship with the landscape they move through. The Kem Kem River was, by all geological indicators, a large and dynamic system, not a single clean channel but a braided, anastamosing network of channels that shifted across a broad floodplain, cutting new paths during floods, abandoning old channels as they filled with sediment, creating oxbow lakes and backwater areas of still or slowly moving water that provided distinct microhabitats different from the main current. This physical complexity, the variety of channel types, depths, flow rates, and associated habitats, was itself a driver of the ecological diversity of the system. Different species specialized for different parts of this physical mosaic. Some fish were adapted for fast-flowing water in the main channels, others preferred the quiet backwaters. Some crocodilians were built for navigating broad, shallow areas, others were more at home in deeper pools. The physical heterogeneity of the river system created a corresponding ecological heterogeneity, a patchwork of opportunities that different species could exploit without necessarily competing directly with one another. Above the water, the surrounding landscape would have offered its own complexity. The immediate river margins would have been lush with moisture-dependent vegetation, stands of what were essentially Cretaceous versions of riverine forest, though composed of plant species unfamiliar to modern eyes. Further from the river, as the ground rose and drainage improved, the vegetation would have changed character, becoming less dense, more reliant on the seasonal rainfall, and less on the permanent availability of river water. And in the areas between the major river channels, there would have been a mosaic of more open environments, perhaps something like the woodlands and open areas that border major river systems in modern tropical Africa. It was in this complex, heterogeneous, seasonally dynamic landscape that the creatures of the Kem Kem lived out their lives, and what creatures they were. To properly appreciate the ecological community of the ancient Kem Kem, it is worth beginning not with the giant predators that tend to capture our imagination most immediately, but with the foundation upon which the entire system rested, the fish. Fish. It seems almost anticlimactic to begin a discussion of the Kem Kem with fish, when we know that this ancient world was home to some of the largest carnivorous dinosaurs ever to walk the earth. But the fish of the Kem Kem were not the modest, unobtrusive creatures that the word might bring to mind. These were fish of extraordinary, almost incomprehensible scale, creatures that would have dominated any aquatic ecosystem they inhabited, that would have made the largest freshwater fish alive today look small by comparison. These were fish that were themselves apex predators, fish that were both the prey of the great reptilian giants and the predators of almost everything else in the river. To understand the Kem Kem, you must first understand that this was, at its core, a river system defined by the productivity of its waters, and that productivity was embodied most dramatically in the scale and diversity of its fish fauna. The most iconic of the Kem Kem fish is undoubtedly Onchopristis, not precisely a fish in the modern, bony fish sense, but a giant sawfish. Sawfish are elasmobranchs related to sharks and rays, characterized by their extraordinary rostrum, the elongated, flattened snout lined on both sides with tooth-like structures called rostral teeth that give the animal its saw-like appearance. Modern sawfish, which survive today in severely reduced populations in tropical coastal and freshwater habitats around the world, are themselves large animals. The largest species can exceed 7 meters in length. But Onchopristis was in a different league entirely. Onchopristis numitus, the species found in the Kem Kem, was a genuinely enormous animal. Estimates based on the recovered rostral teeth and other fragments suggest a total body length that could reach 8 to 9 meters or potentially more, a creature of truly massive proportions moving through the ancient river with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has very few natural enemies. The rostral teeth of Onchopristis are among the most commonly recovered fossils from the Kem Kem beds, and it is easy to see why. They are large, robust, distinctive structures that preserve well and that, once you know what you are looking at, are unmistakable. Each tooth is a flattened, curved structure with a rough, barb-like texture that would have made it an extraordinarily effective tool for the fish's hunting strategy, slashing through schools of smaller fish, stunning and impaling prey with lateral sweeps of the saw-like rostrum. The presence of Onchopristis teeth in such abundance in the Kem Kem beds tells us something important about the ecology of the river. This was a species that was common, not a rare, specialized creature occupying a narrow niche, but a widespread and apparently numerous part of the aquatic community. And its abundance tells us, in turn, that the river was productive enough to support large populations of very large fish. Onchopristis needed to eat substantial quantities of prey to sustain its body mass, and the fact that it was apparently common suggests that the river had the biological productivity to support many individuals of this size. But Onchopristis was not the only remarkable fish in the Kem Kem. The ancient river was home to a diverse array of large, strange, and often spectacular fish species that together formed one of the most remarkable freshwater fish assemblages in the fossil record. There were the coelacanths, ancient lobe-finned fish that trace their lineage back hundreds of millions of years, and that most people know primarily from the dramatic discovery of living specimens in the 20th century, long after science had assumed the group was extinct. In the Kem Kem, coelacanths were present and apparently common, large-bodied, slow-moving fish with their characteristic lobed fins and peculiar gait like swimming motion, occupying the deeper, calmer parts of the river. There were also enormous lungfish, Ceratodus species, relatives of the surviving African, Australian, and South American lungfish that can today grow to impressive sizes in tropical freshwater systems. Cretaceous lungfish in general were larger than their modern counterparts, and in the productive waters of the Kem Kem, these ancient air-breathing fish would have been significant members of the community. Lungfish have a remarkable ability to estivate, to bury themselves in mud and enter a dormant state during dry periods, and this ability would have been particularly valuable in the seasonally dry Kem Kem environment, allowing individuals to survive the most severe dry season conditions and re-emerge when the rains returned. Then there were the various ray-finned fish, the actinopterygians, some of which reached extraordinary sizes. Cretaceous freshwater systems in Africa and other regions were home to fish in groups that are either extinct today or that are now represented only by much smaller relatives. The sheer variety of fish form and function in the ancient Kem Kem River would have been remarkable. Specialized predators, filter feeders, bottom dwellers, open water hunters, fish adapted for the fast current of the main channel, and fish suited to the quiet backwaters. Complex, layered aquatic food web that had been refined over geological time, and that was, in the Cenomanian stage of the Cretaceous, at something close to its peak complexity and productivity. It was this extraordinary abundance of aquatic prey, this river teeming with fish of enormous size and variety, that created the conditions necessary for what was arguably the most unusual aspect of the Kem Kem ecosystem: its remarkable concentration of very large predatory vertebrates. Because what makes the Kem Kem so scientifically fascinating, so ecologically puzzling, and so compelling as a subject for study and discussion, is the fact that this ancient river system appears to have supported a density of large apex predators that has no real parallel in any ecosystem we know of today. Let us take a moment to consider what we mean when we talk about apex predators, and why their density in any given ecosystem is such an important ecological variable. In every natural community on Earth, the number of large predators that an area can support is ultimately constrained by the amount of prey available. Predators, by definition, sit at the top of the food chain, they consume other animals, and are not themselves regularly consumed by anything else. This means that all the energy they obtain for their bodies has passed through at least one other level of the food chain before reaching them, and energy is lost at every transfer. This fundamental fact of ecology, that energy is lost as you move up the food chain, means that top predators are always, necessarily, less common than the prey they eat. In modern ecosystems, this principle plays out consistently. A large African savanna might support a certain number of wildebeest and zebras per square kilometer, but the number of lions per square kilometer is dramatically smaller. A productive ocean might teem with small fish, but the sharks and toothed whales that prey on those fish exist at far lower densities. And in freshwater systems, rivers and lakes, the same principle applies. Large predatory fish or crocodilians may be present, but they are always less common than the smaller prey fish that sustain them. Given this principle, the Kem Kem poses what paleontologists have sometimes called a paradox. Because the fossil record of the Kem Kem beds suggests the presence of not just one or two large apex predators, but an entire community of them, multiple species of very large carnivorous dinosaurs, multiple species of large crocodilian like archosaurs, giant fish, and flying reptiles large enough to take substantial prey. The diversity and apparent abundance of large predators in this system, when measured against the general ecological principle that apex predators are always rare, seems almost impossible. Yet the evidence is there in the rock. Multiple species of giant predator represented by fossils from across the Kem Kem beds, all apparently occupying the same general time and place. How could this work? How could this ecosystem sustain so many large mouths requiring so much meat? The answer, as modern ecological research on this system has begun to reveal, lies in a concept called niche partitioning and in the extraordinary productivity of the Kem Kem River itself. Let us explore both of these ideas in turn, beginning with niche partitioning, because understanding this concept is essential to understanding how the Kem Kem ecosystem functioned. Niche partitioning refers to the way that species sharing the same general habitat and the same general category of resource, in this case, meat, divide up that resource by exploiting it in different ways in different places or at different times. Rather than competing head-to-head for exactly the same prey in exactly the same place at exactly the same time, species that coexist over long periods tend to evolve to partition resources among themselves in ways that reduce direct competition. This is one of the most fundamental organizing principles of ecological communities, and it operates in every ecosystem on Earth to some degree. In the modern African savanna, for example, lions and leopards and cheetahs and wild dogs all occupy broadly similar carnivore niches. They are all medium to large predators of herbivorous mammals, but they partition their niche in multiple ways. Lions hunt primarily large prey in open habitat, often cooperatively. Leopards are more solitary and tend toward ambush hunting in denser cover, taking a wider size range of prey. Cheetahs hunt by speed in open areas, specializing in fast-running medium-sized prey. Wild dogs use hunting to wear down their prey over long distances. Each species has its own particular version of being a large carnivore on the savanna, and these differences reduce direct competition enough to allow multiple species to coexist. In the Kem Kem, the same principle was operating, but across a community of predators that were vastly larger than anything in the modern African savanna, and in an ecosystem that was physically defined by the transition between aquatic and terrestrial environments. The key to understanding how niche partitioning worked in the Kem Kem is recognizing that the river created a fundamental divide between the aquatic world and the land, and that different predators specialized to varying degrees for exploiting prey on one side or the other of that divide. On the land, hunting in the terrestrial environment surrounding the river, lived some of the largest and most fearsome dinosaurian predators ever to walk the earth. Foremost among them was Carcharodontosaurus, a creature whose very name translates to shark-toothed lizard, a name that gives you an immediate sense of what this animal's weaponry was like. Carcharodontosaurus was a member of the Carcharodontosaurids, a group of large carnivorous dinosaurs that were among the dominant land predators of the Cretaceous in the southern continents, in Africa, in South America, and to a lesser extent in other regions. In terms of sheer size, Carcharodontosaurus was in the very top tier of carnivorous dinosaurs, comparable to, or possibly slightly larger than, the famous Tyrannosaurus rex of the northern continents. Estimates of Carcharodontosaurus size vary depending on which specimens are being discussed and how the calculations are made, but the largest individuals almost certainly exceeded 12 meters in length and may have approached or exceeded 1 metric ton in body mass. This was a terrestrial predator of extraordinary scale, bipedal, walking on 2 powerful hind legs with relatively small forelimbs, though not as reduced as those of Tyrannosaurus, and equipped with a massive skull containing teeth that were large, serrated, and laterally flattened in a manner analogous to the teeth of great white sharks, hence the common name. The ecology of Carcharodontosaurus in the Kem Kem environment was almost certainly focused on terrestrial prey, the large dinosaurian herbivores that inhabited the non-aquatic environments of the region. Though the Kem Kem beds preserve far fewer records of large herbivorous dinosaurs than of large predators, a pattern that has itself attracted scientific attention and discussion, there were certainly sauropod dinosaurs, the enormous long-necked plant-eaters present in the landscape, and these would have been the primary prey targets for a predator of Carcharodontosaurus's scale and design. Hunting sauropods was a formidable challenge. These were animals that could exceed 20 meters in length and weigh many tens of metric tons, prey that could not simply be overpowered by a single predator through brute force. Large carnivorous dinosaurs like Carcharodontosaurus almost certainly employed a hunting strategy that emphasized the infliction of large wounds, slashing attacks with those shark-like teeth that would cause massive blood loss and debilitation rather than immediate killing, followed by pursuing or waiting for the prey to weaken. It was a brutal and energetically demanding strategy, but it was the approach that the design of these large-toothed predators suggests, and it would have been effective against prey that was itself so massive that any single killing blow was essentially impossible. In the Kem Kem, Carcharodontosaurus represented the terrestrial apex, the ultimate land predator, a creature that could potentially threaten almost any other dinosaur in the ecosystem given sufficient opportunity. But it was fundamentally a land animal. Its body, bipedal, fast-moving, with those reduced forelimbs, was built for the terrestrial environment. It was not built for wading into deep water after fish. Its hunting strategies, its prey preferences, its very physical design placed it squarely in the terrestrial portion of the Kem Kem ecosystem, and this is where niche partitioning becomes visible. Because at the same time that Carcharodontosaurus dominated the land, a very different kind of giant predator dominated the river. Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. If there is one creature whose story is most deeply intertwined with the story of the Kem Kem, whose biology is most extraordinary, whose scientific history is most dramatic, and whose ecological role was most unusual and most consequential for our understanding of dinosaurian diversity, it is Spinosaurus. This animal, whose name means spine lizard, was first described more than a century ago based on fragmentary fossil material from Egypt, and it has occupied an unusual and sometimes controversial position in paleontological science ever since. But in recent years, new discoveries and new analytical methods have transformed our understanding of Spinosaurus so completely that the picture we now have of this animal is almost unrecognizable compared to what scientists believed even a few decades ago. To understand what Spinosaurus was and what made it so remarkable, it helps to start with what it was not. It was not a typical large carnivorous dinosaur. It was not a bigger version of Tyrannosaurus, or a close relative of Carcharodontosaurus, or simply another large bipedal predator competing for terrestrial prey in the Kem Kem landscape. It was something far more unusual, a large predatory dinosaur that had evolved over millions of years of natural selection, a suite of anatomical features that made it adapted for life in and around water in a way that no other large theropod dinosaur we know of has approached. Let us begin with the most visually dramatic feature of Spinosaurus, the sail. Running along the back of Spinosaurus, supported by enormously elongated neural spines projecting upward from the vertebrae, was a structure that in life may have formed a dramatic sail-like crest reaching heights of 1.5 to 2 meters or more above the animal's back. The neural spines of Spinosaurus are extraordinary objects, long, slender, round in cross-section, and in the largest individuals reaching lengths that dwarf the equivalent structures in almost any other known dinosaur. These spines were certainly covered in life by skin and possibly by other tissues, and whether the resulting structure was a true thin sail, analogous in general shape to the sails of some modern lizards or the extinct Dimetrodon, or a thicker, more fleshy hump, analogous perhaps to the hump of a bison or a camel, has been debated among paleontologists for years. But the sail or hump was only the most visually striking of Spinosaurus's unusual features. There was also the skull, long, low, and narrow, quite unlike the deep, powerful skulls of large predatory dinosaurs like Carcharodontosaurus or Tyrannosaurus. The skull of Spinosaurus was instead shaped more like that of a large modern crocodilian, an elongated rostrum lined with interlocking conical teeth, lacking the serrations characteristic of most other large theropod dinosaurs, and featuring a distinctive rosette of enlarged teeth at the very tip of the snout, exactly the configuration that modern fish-eating crocodilians use to grip slippery, struggling fish. The nostrils of Spinosaurus were positioned well back along the skull, not at the very tip as in most dinosaurs, again a feature shared with animals that spend significant time with their heads in or near water. Then there were the forelimbs. Unlike many large theropod dinosaurs, in which the forelimbs were relatively reduced and functionally limited, Spinosaurus had substantially developed forelimbs with large, powerful claws. This again differs from what you would expect in a purely terrestrial predator and suggests an animal that made regular use of its arms, perhaps for pinning fish or for maneuvering in aquatic environments. The feet of Spinosaurus were unusual as well. Rather than the narrow, bird-like feet of a fast-running terrestrial predator, Spinosaurus appears to have had broader, more paddle-like feet, with evidence suggesting the possibility of some webbing between the toes, a feature that would have provided both stability in soft substrate and some degree of propulsion in water. But perhaps the most remarkable of Spinosaurus's unusual features, the one that, when it was formally described and analyzed by paleontologist Nizar Ibrahim and his colleagues in 2014, most dramatically changed the scientific community's understanding of this animal, was the tail. The tail of Spinosaurus, as reconstructed from newly discovered vertebrae, was not the typical stiffened counterbalanced tail of a bipedal dinosaur built for terrestrial locomotion. Instead, it was a flexible, laterally flattened structure, a structure that in its general form resembles nothing so much as the tail of a modern swimming animal, designed to generate thrust through lateral undulation in water. This was a discovery that fundamentally and irreversibly changed the status of Spinosaurus in the hierarchy of dinosaurian ecology, because a tail like this is not built for running on land. A tail like this is built for swimming. Taken together, the elongated crocodilian-like skull, the fish-gripping teeth, the retracted nostrils, the robust forelimbs, the broad feet, the paddle-like tail, the anatomy of Spinosaurus tells a coherent story. This was an animal that had, over evolutionary time, developed a suite of features that made it highly effective in aquatic environments. Not a fully aquatic animal, it retained the basic body plan of a theropod dinosaur and would certainly have been capable of moving on land, but an animal whose primary ecological role, whose primary hunting ground, whose primary domain was the water. And here's where the size of Spinosaurus becomes particularly significant. Because Spinosaurus was not merely large, it may have been the largest carnivorous dinosaur that ever lived. The various estimates that have been put forward for Spinosaurus's body length range from approximately 14 to perhaps 18 meters, with some researchers putting the figure even higher for the largest individuals. These are numbers that exceed the largest confident estimates for Tyrannosaurus rex and that match or exceed the largest estimates for Carcharodontosaurus. In terms of body mass, the estimates vary considerably depending on the assumed body density and the particular reconstruction used, but Spinosaurus was certainly a massive animal, likely in the range of 7 to 14 metric tons, though this range reflects genuine scientific uncertainty rather than a precise measurement. What this means in ecological terms is that the dominant aquatic predator of the Kem Kem River system, the creature most specialized for hunting in the water, for pursuing the enormous fish of the ancient river, was also potentially the largest carnivorous dinosaur that we know of from the fossil record. The river itself supported an animal that, in terms of sheer body size, was at the absolute extreme of what a terrestrial and semi-aquatic predatory vertebrate has ever achieved. To understand how Spinosaurus hunted in the ancient river, we need to consider what specific anatomical evidence tells us about its locomotion and behavior in water. The dense bones of Spinosaurus, denser than those of most other dinosaurs of comparable size, more similar in their cortical thickness to those of modern semi-aquatic animals like hippos and modern crocodilians, are particularly informative. Dense bones in aquatic animals serve a specific function. They act as ballast, reducing an animal's tendency to float and allowing it to maintain a lower position in the water column with less muscular effort. An animal with denser bones can more easily walk along a river bottom or maintain a position in shallow water with just its head above the surface, without the effort required to prevent buoyancy from pushing it upward. This is exactly the bone density pattern seen in hippos, which spend much of their time walking along the bottom of African rivers and lakes. It is also seen in modern penguins, which need to overcome their feathers' insulating air content to dive effectively. In Spinosaurus, this dense bone tissue distributed throughout the skeleton, particularly in the limb bones, would have served the same basic function, making it easier for the animal to operate at or below the water surface without constantly fighting its own buoyancy. Combined with the paddle-like tail for aquatic propulsion and the fish-catching skull design, the picture is of an animal that could wade in shallow water and use its long neck and crocodilian-like jaws to strike at fish, or that could submerge more deeply and use its tail to propel itself in pursuit of prey, stabilized in the water column by its dense bones. It was, in short, a Cretaceous river monster of the most spectacular kind, not a fantasy creature but a real, scientifically documented animal whose existence forces us to completely reconceptualize what a dinosaur could be and what ecological roles dinosaurs could occupy. The scientific history of Spinosaurus is itself a story worth telling in some depth, because it perfectly encapsulates both the excitement and the frustration of paleontological science. The way in which our understanding of ancient creatures can be transformed by new discoveries, and the way in which the irreplaceable nature of fossil material means that losses of specimens can set the science back by decades or more. The first scientific description of Spinosaurus dates to 1915, the work of the German paleontologist Ernst Stromer von Reichenbach. Stromer was a remarkable figure, a Bavarian nobleman and scientist who had made multiple expeditions to North Africa in the early 20th century, traveling to remote and challenging desert environments at a time when such travel was far more arduous and dangerous than it is today, motivated by a passionate belief that the rocks of North Africa held important fossil secrets that the scientific world had not yet unlocked. Stromer was right. In the Bahariya Formation of Egypt, a geological unit broadly related to and broadly contemporaneous with the Kem Kem beds, Stromer's expeditions in the early 1910s recovered remarkable material. Not only the bones that would eventually be described as Spinosaurus, but also material representing other large predatory dinosaurs from the same general fauna, including animals that would later be recognized as relatives of creatures known from the Kem Kem. Stromer brought these specimens back to Munich, to the Bavarian State Collection for Paleontology and Geology, where they were prepared, studied, and displayed. The original Spinosaurus material that Stromer described, the holotype specimen, consisted of several vertebrae with their distinctive elongated neural spines, some teeth, and a few other fragmentary bones. It was far from a complete skeleton, but it was enough for Stromer to recognize that he was dealing with something quite new and quite extraordinary, a large theropod dinosaur with neural spines of unprecedented length. He named it Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the spine lizard of Egypt, and published his description in 1915. For decades afterward, the original Stromer material remained the primary basis for scientific understanding of Spinosaurus. And for decades, the interpretation of this animal was essentially that it was a large but otherwise fairly standard theropod dinosaur, perhaps somewhat unusual in its elongated spines, but not fundamentally different in its ecology from other large predatory dinosaurs. Early reconstructions showed Spinosaurus as a fairly conventional bipedal predator, upright, with a sail on its back, hunting terrestrial prey in much the way that other large theropods were assumed to have done. But the original Stromer specimens were destined for a fate that has no parallel in the history of paleontology, a fate that stands as one of the most poignant and frustrating losses in the entire history of science. Stromer himself was politically complicated, a member of an aristocratic Bavarian family who had no sympathy for the Nazi regime that came to power in Germany in 1933, and who spent years fruitlessly trying to persuade the museum authorities in Munich to evacuate the irreplaceable fossil collections to a safer location, as the Second World War intensified and Allied bombing raids on German cities became increasingly frequent and devastating. His warnings tragically went unheeded. On the night of April 24 and into the morning of April 25, 1944, British Royal Air Force bombing raids struck Munich with devastating effect. The Bavarian State Collection for Paleontology and Geology took a direct hit. The museum burned. And in the fire, the original holotype specimens of Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the bones that Stromer had brought back from Egypt 3 decades earlier, the physical evidence on which all scientific understanding of this animal was based, were destroyed, completely and irrecoverably. The loss was a catastrophe for paleontological science. Without the original material, without the ability to re-examine the actual bones with modern analytical techniques, the study of Spinosaurus was left working from Stromer's published descriptions and the photographs and drawings that had been made of the specimens before their destruction. These records were valuable, but they could not substitute for the physical specimens themselves. They could not be CT scanned, could not have their bone chemistry analyzed, could not be physically measured with modern precision instruments. For decades, therefore, the scientific understanding of Spinosaurus stagnated. New specimens from the region were occasionally discovered and described, but they were fragmentary and difficult to interpret in the absence of the original reference material. The animal remained something of a mystery, known to have existed, known to have been large, known to have its distinctive sail, but poorly understood in terms of its ecology, its behavior, its relationships to other dinosaurs, and the details of its anatomy. This changed dramatically and completely in 2014, thanks largely to the work of Nizar Ibrahim, a Moroccan-German-American paleontologist whose personal connection to the Kem Kem and whose remarkable detective work in tracking down new Spinosaurus material created the conditions for a scientific revolution in our understanding of this animal. Ibrahim's story is itself worth telling because it illustrates the human dimension of paleontology, the way in which personal motivation, geographical connection, and sometimes sheer good fortune intersect with scientific method to produce breakthrough discoveries. Ibrahim had grown up with a deep personal interest in the Kem Kem region and its fossils, and his scientific career had from an early stage been focused on North African dinosaurs. In the years leading up to 2014, he became aware of new Spinosaurus material that had been discovered in the Kem Kem beds, specifically material recovered by local fossil hunters from the region and eventually making its way into the scientific literature and into museum collections. The material was fragmentary, as Kem Kem material typically is, but it included pieces that, taken together with information recovered from other sources, began to build a picture of Spinosaurus's anatomy that was far more detailed than anything available from the original Stromer specimens. The crucial challenge was assembling this picture coherently, combining the new material with Stromer's original descriptions, with other previously described Spinosaurus specimens from various collections, and with the anatomical context provided by related dinosaurs, to produce a scientifically defensible skeletal reconstruction of Spinosaurus that reflected its actual anatomy as accurately as the available evidence permitted. This is a process that involves not just fossil preparation and measurement, but sophisticated digital modeling and comparative anatomy, the kind of multidisciplinary approach that has become increasingly central to modern paleontology. The reconstruction that Ibrahim and his colleagues published in the journal Science in 2014 was remarkable. It showed Spinosaurus not as a conventional bipedal predator with a sail on its back, but as a semi-aquatic animal with a combination of features that, taken together, argued strongly for a fundamentally aquatic lifestyle unlike that of any other known large theropod dinosaur. The dense bones, the paddle-like tail, the retracted nostrils, the fish-gripping teeth, all of these features were described and analyzed in detail, and the cumulative case they made for Spinosaurus as a swimming, fish-eating, semi-aquatic predator was compelling. The scientific community's response was not unanimously enthusiastic. As with any major revision of established understanding, there were skeptics and critics, researchers who questioned specific aspects of the reconstruction, or who argued that the evidence for aquatic locomotion was not as conclusive as Ibrahim and colleagues claimed. Science is, appropriately, a skeptical enterprise, and major claims require major evidence. The debates that followed the 2014 paper were vigorous and productive, driving additional research, additional discoveries, and increasingly refined analytical methods that have, over the decades since the original publication, progressively strengthened the case for a semi-aquatic Spinosaurus while clarifying, and in some cases modifying specific details of the original reconstruction. The discovery of additional tail vertebrae after 2014, which confirmed the paddle-like morphology of the tail in even greater detail, was particularly important in consolidating the scientific consensus around the aquatic lifestyle hypothesis. And biomechanical analyses of how the tail functioned in water, showing that its shape and flexibility would have generated effective propulsive thrust during lateral undulation, in a manner analogous to the swimming motion of modern aquatic animals, provided the kind of functional confirmation that moves a hypothesis from plausible interpretation to well-supported scientific conclusion. Today, the picture of Spinosaurus that has emerged from this cascade of research is of an animal unlike any other known dinosaur, a semi-aquatic giant that spent much of its life in the ancient rivers and waterways of North Africa, pursuing enormous fish with the efficiency of a crocodilian-like ambush hunter, but on a scale that exceeded any modern crocodilian by a factor of several. An animal that was not simply large, but that was specifically, exquisitely adapted for the particular ecological role it occupied in the Kem Kem ecosystem, the role of the river's dominant vertebrate predator, the creature at the apex of the aquatic food chain. The aquatic dominance of Spinosaurus in the Kem Kem River did not mean that the water was a simple or unchallenged domain. The ancient river was itself a complex ecosystem with multiple large predatory vertebrates, and understanding how these creatures coexisted requires examining the remarkable diversity of crocodilian relatives that shared the ancient waterways with Spinosaurus and with each other. Modern crocodilians, the crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and gharials that survive today, are the last more diverse group that, during the Mesozoic era, occupied an extraordinary range of ecological roles and body plans. The Cretaceous world in particular was home to crocodiliform archosaurs, the broader group to which true crocodilians belong of remarkable variety, some of which were fully terrestrial predators with upright posture and long legs, some of which were armored herbivores, some of which were giant aquatic predators that make even modern saltwater crocodiles look modest. In the Kem Kem, this diversity was represented by several remarkable species. The most dramatic of the Kem Kem's crocodiliform archosaurs is Sarcosuchus imperator, whose popular name, SuperCroc, captures something of the impression this animal makes on anyone encountering its remains for the first time. Sarcosuchus was genuinely enormous, with length estimates approaching 9 to 10 meters or more for the largest individuals, making it comparable in length to some modern buses. Its skull alone reached lengths of approximately 1.75 meters, and its body was heavily armored with large, interlocking osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin, that would have made it formidable both as a predator and as a target for any would-be attacker. Sarcosuchus is known primarily from slightly older deposits than the classic Kem Kem beds. It is most abundantly represented in the Aptian and early Albian deposits of Niger, where remarkable specimens have been recovered, but it overlaps chronologically and geographically with the Kem Kem fauna in ways that make it a relevant and important component of the broader picture. In its ecology, Sarcosuchus was almost certainly a generalist ambush predator in the crocodilian mold, lying in wait in rivers and at water's edge, using its immense body and powerful jaws to take a wide range of prey including fish, other aquatic animals, and terrestrial animals that came to drink. The relationship between a giant crocodiliform like Sarcosuchus and a giant semi-aquatic dinosaur like Spinosaurus in the same river system raises interesting questions about competition and coexistence. Both were large aquatic predators. Both were probably eating many of the same types of prey, particularly the large fish of the river system. How did they partition their niche? The answer probably lies in behavioral and microhabitat differences, differences in where each species preferred to hunt, what depth of water it favored, whether it was more active in fast or slow-moving water, and what size range of prey each species most effectively targeted. Both species were large enough and formidable enough that direct conflict between them would have been expensive for both parties, and natural selection would have favored behavioral strategies that minimized such confrontations. There were also smaller crocodiliform species in the Kem Kem, animals in the 1 to 3 meter range that occupied distinctly different ecological roles from the giants. These smaller species would have focused on prey items that neither Spinosaurus nor Sarcosuchus would have bothered with: small fish, frogs, small dinosaurs, invertebrates. Their presence added additional layers of ecological complexity to the aquatic system, filling niches that the giants left open and contributing to the overall biodiversity of the river community. Beyond the large predators and the giant fish, the Kem Kem River was home to a rich array of smaller aquatic life. Turtles, both small species and some remarkably large ones, were present in the river system, representing important prey items for predators of appropriate size and themselves serving as predators of smaller aquatic animals. Modern turtle faunas in tropical rivers can be remarkably diverse, with multiple species occupying different microhabitats and feeding on different food types, and the Cretaceous river systems of North Africa were apparently no different in this regard. Frogs and other small amphibians, though less well documented in the Kem Kem fossil record than some other groups, were almost certainly present, as they are in virtually every freshwater system in the world that provides appropriate habitat. Small fish of many species inhabited the shallower, weed-grown margins of the river, where the great predators rarely ventured. Invertebrates of various kinds, insects, freshwater crustaceans, mollusks, formed the lowest levels of the aquatic food web, converting plant material and microbial productivity into animal biomass that could then be consumed by small fish and other small predators, and thence by the progressively larger predators that sit above them in the food chain. The picture that emerges from synthesizing all of this information is of a river ecosystem of extraordinary complexity and productivity, a system with multiple trophic levels, high species diversity at every level, and an energy flow that was sufficient to support not just one or two large apex predators but an entire community of them, coexisting through a combination of niche partitioning, seasonal resource dynamics, and the fundamental productivity of the river itself. And above the river, in the air that hung warm and humid over the ancient water, there was yet another dimension of the Kem Kem ecosystem that we have not yet fully explored, because the Kem Kem was not only a world of fish and crocodilians and swimming dinosaurs, it was also a world of flying giants. The Cretaceous sky was not empty. At the time of the Kem Kem, birds, the descendants of small theropod dinosaurs, already existed, though they were still in the early stages of their evolutionary diversification and were generally smaller and less ecologically dominant than the birds of the modern world. Far more spectacular in terms of sheer size and visual impact were the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that had evolved powered flight independently of both birds and bats, and that had, over the course of the Mesozoic era, diversified into an extraordinary range of sizes, forms, and ecological roles. By the Cretaceous period, pterosaurs had evolved into animals of a scale that defies easy comprehension. The largest pterosaurs of the late Cretaceous, animals like Quetzalcoatlus and Hatzegopteryx, had wingspans approaching 10 to 12 meters, making them the largest flying animals in the history of life on Earth. But even in the earlier Cretaceous, during the time of the Kem Kem, pterosaurs of impressive and sometimes spectacular size were already present and ecologically significant. The Kem Kem beds have yielded pterosaur remains that represent multiple species, including some of significant size. Among the most notable is Elanca saharica, a pterosaur known from fragmentary material that suggests an animal with a wingspan of perhaps 6 meters, large enough to be a significant aerial predator or scavenger in the Kem Kem ecosystem. There were also smaller pterosaur species, which would have occupied different ecological roles, perhaps catching small fish at the surface in a manner analogous to modern terns or gannets, or hunting insects and other small prey over the floodplain. The role of large pterosaurs in the Kem Kem ecosystem was almost certainly multifaceted. Some were probably primarily piscivores, fish eaters, using their long jaws and keen eyesight to spot and strike at fish near the surface of the river. Others may have been more generalist predators or even scavengers, feeding on carcasses left by the larger dinosaurian predators. The presence of multiple pterosaur species in the Kem Kem adds yet another dimension to the already extraordinary diversity of the ecosystem's predator community, filling the aerial niche in the same way that vultures, eagles, and herons fill the aerial niche in modern river ecosystems. The coexistence of aerial, terrestrial, and aquatic predators of large size in the same ecosystem is itself a remarkable feature of the Kem Kem. It suggests that resources were available in sufficient abundance across multiple habitat types to support apex predators in every one of those habitat types simultaneously. It is a level of predator diversity that has no real analog in any modern ecosystem we know of, and it speaks to the extraordinary productivity of the ancient river and its surrounding landscape. How, fundamentally, was this productivity sustained? The answer lies in a combination of factors: the warm Cretaceous climate, which accelerated biological processes; the productive river system, which continuously imported nutrients from upstream and created the conditions for explosive aquatic productivity; the seasonal monsoon cycle, which drove annual pulses of high productivity followed by periods of concentration that made prey unusually accessible; and the evolutionary history of the region, which had produced fish of extraordinary size that could themselves serve as prey items large enough to sustain predators of equally extraordinary size. In a very real sense, the Kem Kem was a system in which the exceptional productiveness of the aquatic base, the river with its giant fish, supported an exceptional diversity and abundance of large predators above it. The fish were the key. Remove the giant fish and the ecosystem collapses. There is simply not enough prey to sustain Spinosaurus or Sarcosuchus or the other large aquatic predators. But with the giant fish present, maintained at high population sizes by the productive river and the seasonal monsoon cycle, the system could sustain predator diversity that staggers the modern ecological imagination. Fully appreciate the Kem Kem ecosystem, we must also consider the herbivores, the plant-eating dinosaurs that inhabited the terrestrial portions of the landscape, and that formed the prey base for the great terrestrial predators like Carnivorous. The fossil record of herbivorous dinosaurs from the Kem Kem beds is, as mentioned earlier, curiously sparse compared to the record of predators, a pattern that has generated considerable discussion and some debate among paleontologists. The disproportion of predators to prey in the fossil record of a given locality does not necessarily mean that predators outnumbered prey in the living ecosystem. That would be ecologically impossible, as we have discussed. It more often reflects differential preservation, the fact that different animals fossilize at different rates depending on their size, their habitat preferences, their bone density, and a variety of other factors. Large predators, which tend to have denser bones and which may have been more likely to die in or near the river, where burial by sediment is more likely than in drier, upland habitats, may simply be better represented in river-deposited sediments than large herbivores that lived in the drier, upland portions of the landscape where fossilization is less likely. Nonetheless, herbivorous dinosaurs were certainly present in the Kem Kem landscape. Sauropods, those enormous long-necked plant eaters that are in many ways the most characteristic herbivorous dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, are represented in the Kem Kem beds by at least some fragmentary material. Rebbichosaurid sauropods, a group of diplodocoid sauropods known from several Cretaceous-age sites across Africa and South America, were likely present in the region, and possibly also titanosaur sauropods, which were one of the dominant herbivore groups of the later Cretaceous worldwide. What we can say with confidence is that the terrestrial landscape surrounding the Kem Kem River supported a community of large herbivorous dinosaurs, probably multiple species representing different sizes and different feeding strategies, that in turn supported the great terrestrial predators. The sauropods would have been the largest prey available, animals of genuinely enormous body mass that even a predator as formidable as Carcharodontosaurus would have found challenging to tackle. Smaller herbivorous dinosaurs, possibly including various ornithischians, though the record from this region is limited, may also have been present, providing prey in a more manageable size range. The terrestrial plant-eating community would have migrated seasonally in response to the availability of food and water, moving toward the river during the dry season as other water sources dried up, and dispersing more widely across the landscape during the wet season when water and vegetation were available in abundance. This seasonal movement would have created predictable patterns of prey availability for the terrestrial predators, and would have resulted in regular encounters between the terrestrial giants, both predators and prey, at the river margins and water sources that remained during the dry season. The margins of the Kem Kem River, therefore, were zones of intense ecological activity, places where the aquatic and terrestrial worlds intersected, where Spinosaurus came in from the water and Carcharodontosaurus came down from the land, where giant fish churned the shallows and giant sauropods waded out to drink, where pterosaurs wheeled overhead and crocodilians lurked in the reed beds. These margins were the ecological crossroads of the Kem Kem world, the places where all the threads of the ecosystem came together, where the different niches and the different specialists met and occasionally collided, where the drama of predation and competition and survival played out most intensely. Imagine standing at such a margin during the dry season of the ancient Kem Kem, 100 million years ago, in the late afternoon of a Cretaceous day. The air is hot and humid, laden with the smell of water and vegetation and the musky scent of large reptiles. The river, reduced from its wet season extent, runs low and warm, its current slow, its surface disturbed by the movements of enormous fish cruising just below. Along the bank, a group of large sauropods picks its cautious way through the reed beds toward the water, their enormous necks swaying as they move, their massive feet sinking into the soft mud at the river's edge. They are thirsty. The dry season has been hard, and this stretch of river is one of the few reliable water sources remaining in the landscape, but the river is not safe. From somewhere in the shallows, barely visible beneath the brown water, something enormous and patient is watching. The long, narrow snout, the eyes positioned high on the skull just above the waterline, the vast, still body dense enough to rest motionless on the river bottom without effort. Spinosaurus, waiting, the ancient river holds its breath. This is the world of the Kem Kem. This is the lost world that the fossil record, painstakingly assembled from fragments of bone and tooth and scale, allows us to reconstruct. It is a world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary violence, of ecological complexity and predatory power, of a balance so finely tuned and so perfectly calibrated to its particular conditions that when those conditions changed, when the seas rose and the river began its slow retreat, the entire system unraveled, and the giants of the Kem Kem were lost forever. But before we come to that end, there is more to understand about this remarkable world, more about the creatures that inhabited it, more about the science that has revealed their lives to us, and more about the remarkable story of discovery and loss and rediscovery that has defined the paleontological history of the Kem Kem. That story continues in Part 2. But for now, let us sit with what we have learned about the foundation of this extraordinary ancient world, the river, the fish, the monsoon, the niche partitioning that made possible what should not have been possible, and let its strangeness and its wonder fully settle. 100 million years ago, in the land that would one day become the scorched badlands of North Africa, a river ran, and in that river and along its banks and in the air above it there were giants. Real, living, breathing giants, animals of a scale and variety that the modern world cannot match, occupying an ecosystem of extraordinary complexity and productivity, coexisting through the ecological logic of niche partitioning and the generous abundance of a river fed by ancient monsoons. We know about them because a few of their bones, a fraction of the individuals that once lived and died in this ancient world, survived the ravages of time, were buried in sediment, were mineralized over millions of years, and were eventually exposed by erosion and found by the sharp eyes and dedicated effort of scientists and fossil hunters who recognized them for what they were: windows into a lost world. The science that has allowed us to interpret these windows, to move from a tooth or a vertebra to a reconstruction of a living animal in its ecological community, is itself a remarkable achievement of human ingenuity and dedication. And that science, the detective work of paleontology, the painstaking assembly of knowledge from the most fragmentary of evidence,